Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and you're listening to episode 146 on paleo gaming with Thomas Clements and Jake Atterby, both of the University of Birmingham. Now, this episode might seem a little self-indulgent interviewing some of my co-hosts in the Paleocast Gaming Network, but it's based on the release of their new paper looking at the link between gaming and paleontology. How are paleontological sciences depicted in computer games? Are they a force for good or bad? And why should we care anyway? In the first part of this two-part episode, we look at the context of why such a study was needed, what the current state of play is, and which kinds of tropes have established themselves in this section of pop culture. In the second part, we'll be looking at how such games could be used for education in the future. And as always, we'll have images and plenty of videos to accompany this episode on our website. And if this subject interests you, then please check out the Paleocast Gaming Network on YouTube, where we explore paleo games in greater depth. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thomas, Jake, thank you so much for coming onto the show today. It is a pleasure to have you.
Hello.
Hi.
Right, we always like to get to know our interviewees first. And Thomas, you are the first person who has ever been on Paleocast twice.
Is that right? No,
that is right. This is an honor.
Episode 63, if you're interested.
Oh, well, I was gonna put that out myself. I was gonna ask you if you've now managed to figure out the Tully Monster issue. Do you know what it is yet? Fully?
No.
Still.
It's a headache.
A headache. Right. But anyway, we know you. We don't care about you anymore. Jake, you're new. You're new and exciting. Tell us about yourself. Who are you? How did you get into paleontology? What do you study?
Hi. So I'm Jake. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist at the University of Birmingham. And how I got into paleontology is basically a total fluke. I'd never thought it was an attainable thing. It was always like being a, astronaut or something. But then I had a really amazing geography teacher who then encouraged me to go into geology. And then one day in geology class, we were looking at fossil shells and teeth, and it suddenly dawned on me that I'd found paleontology hiding in geology this entire time. And since then, I've worked on all sorts of various fossil fishes, and now I'm working on ancient animals in video games, which is not something I prepared for even remotely.
Yeah, that sneaky paleontology is always hiding in geology, in the back of biology, and then hiding in paleontology is just maths.
Yes.
Yeah, it's all a lie.
It's all just maths under the hood. Right, so Thomas, give us an update on yourself as well.
My name is Thomas. I am an experimental taphonomist. So that means that I'm interested in trying to understand how animals turn into fossils, or the processes from the minute an animal dies to starting to decay, all the way into becoming geologically stabilized and then eventually found. I've just finished a fellowship at the University of Birmingham, and I am moving to Germany next week.
This is news to me. We'll catch up on this later. But Jake, you alluded to computer games. I want to know how two paleontologists kind of got involved in computer games. Where did this crossover come from?
Kind of how it all really kicked off when we all started working on the Paleocast Gaming Network channel. But I think me and Thomas were talking about this earlier. We've both had experiences interacting with the public, doing scientific outreach in museums, where young kids especially have come to us and asked us questions about paleontology video games, as if it's something that all paleontologists just know about, which is really weird and really interesting. We've just written a paper, we've just published a paper about this, basically. It's almost like a guideline for science communicators to understand the public perception of paleontology that the public would have, assuming that they've not really interacted with paleontologists before. Their sole form of engagement has been through video games, and what kind of weird misconceptions and factoids would they gain by coming at paleontology from that angle?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really interesting as well is that when most people think about paleontologists, they imagine us sort of working in a museum or sitting in a lab, but it's really important to us to understand how the public perceives paleontology, and also just within science in general. I've been a gamer pretty much all my life, and I thought it was really fascinating that during COVID, this brilliant paper came out, which was looking at how video games can be used to educate people about volcanoes. And when I saw this paper, I remember speaking to Jake and to a lot of our other co-authors and just saying, hey, like, we could totally do something like this for paleontology. And, feeding back into what Jake just said about the Paleocast gaming network, like, there are so many games that have paleo in it. It was kind of a no-brainer, really. So that's kind of how the project got started.
Okay, so I guess my first question would be, why would you bother? Like, computer games, what does it matter? What paleontology is doing in computer games is just computer games. Why is it any big deal that you need to look at and try and figure out, how many people play these computer games anyway?
Yeah, I think that's a really super useful is not the right word, super important question. I think that one thing that we, like, as paleontologists, often gets talked about is the impact of media on our science. So, for instance, when Jurassic Park was released, there was a huge plethora of people who suddenly got interested in fossils and dinosaurs and in paleontology. And quite a lot of, the generation above me and my generation of paleontologists can all hark their interest back to Jurassic Park. And, that's just a film. Now, we know from our research in this paper that I think we cite that there was a report in 2020 that said that 2.7 billion people play video games. And, if loads of those games have paleontology in them, then that's a huge, huge amount of people which are interacting with paleontology and meeting paleontology. And it might be the only interaction they have with fossils or with ancient animals or with the concept of paleontological science.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because there are so many people who just don't have access to museums for all sorts of different socioeconomic reasons. And also they just don't necessarily live close to a museum. So there is this massive untapped market of people whose almost primary source of paleontological engagement is through video games, which is really weird to think of.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing as well is that video games, with science outreach and engagement, what normally happens is, if we do an event, then we get to meet people and they come to the event, and then that's it. At the end of the day, they go home. Whereas with video games, they play these games over and over and over again. And so they're not only are they exposed to a huge amount of paleontological information, but they also then potentially get exposed to negative or incorrect tropes consistently over and over again. And if video games perpetuate tropes, and those tropes become commonplace across games because, one game developer sees that another game has done it, then those tropes become almost part of, well, they literally become a trope. They become part of the sort of cultural norm. So it is important for us to try and understand these things so we can tailor our scientific engagement for it.
Okay, I'm just thinking of the paleontological games I played as a kid. I played a lot of Turok 2 for the
Classic.
N64. Mm-hmm. I played Super Mario World for the SNES. Sort of paleo. I mean, how many paleo games actually are there?
That's the most weirdest part of this, because technically there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games with some form of paleontological theme, But that's what we've tried to do with this paper, is try to categorize them, because some of these games just use paleontology as sort of set dressing, or like the aesthetic. Like, I don't know, like Fortnite, for instance, has dinosaur-themed skins, or there is a dating simulator that has dinosaur puns in it, or something like that. That's not necessarily what we're interested in. We're interested in the range of games that feature paleontology as a sort of core component of the gameplay, which again is still a lot. It is crazy just how many there are.
So I was just playing Mario Kart 8 the other day, and I realized that in the walls of the valleys in Choco Mountain, there are a load of fossil fishes, and they're showing fossil fish ecology. There's one fossil fish fossilized with another fossil fish in its mouth. And I was just like, wow, like for someone to actually put that in, they must have seen a fossil of that at some point. It's so weird, just like how many little bits of paleontological information just get incorporated, even if it's just the tiniest little bit. It's there, and maybe I only see it as because I am a paleontologist, but still, it's there. It's really interesting just how many games there are that have paleontology in them.
Yeah, not just like I think a lot of the games where what we would consider set dressing, which is, I suppose, that Mario Kart would fall into that. You know, it's not about the paleontology; it's just something that happens in the background. One of my favorites is it? Oh no, I've called myself out on this now. Is it Battlefield 4?
It's one of the
battlefields where there's an Easter egg where if you shoot a certain light on a ship and then you move to another part of the map and you parachute off and blow something up on the way down, it spawns in a megalodon, which then like leaps out of the water. And yeah, I mean, it absolutely has no sort of educational sort of use at all, really. But at the same time, you know, it's like a cultural thing. People understand and appreciate and like having these sort of fossils in their video games, if that makes sense.
Yeah, these themes are so ingrained in the public psyche almost.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Battlefield 4, it's Battlefield 1 as well. It's in, because I was a big fan of the Battlefields.
Yeah, I used to play a lot of Battlefield games.
Yeah. And then there's the equivalent in Apex Legends now with a giant plesiosaur, but it's like a plushy plesiosaur. Anyway, if you know any more, audience, comment.
We had a comment on the paper at some point where someone sort of brought up this idea of like, oh, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you talk about this? We actually, almost every comment on the paper is, why didn't you talk about this? You could probably write a book on every single game if you were to consider every tiny little tangential, you know, connection a paleontological game. Does that make sense? We could be here forever if we would cover every single one.
Or we could write a whole book on whether Yoshi is a dinosaur or not, because that makes people very upset.
We should do that.
Right. But we are focusing just on those that, you know, like properly concentrate on paleontology as a core element of their game. So out of those, who are these games actually aimed at, and what is their purpose?
Who is it? Well, I mean, it's such a broad question, because the types of games that incorporate paleontology, well, we managed to split them up into 5 main categories. So the most prolific sort of category is using ancient animals as adversaries. So we've already talked about Turok. You know, famously, Turok is a dinosaur hunter, and you know the player has to basically slaughter waves of dinosaurs in order to progress through levels. But then other types of games are ancient animal simulators, where you can play as an ancient animal. Games like Saurian, where you can play as dinosaurs. There's obviously management simulators, so games like Jurassic World Evolution, where you manage parks and manage dinosaurs within those parks. And then there's games where fossils are important collectibles. So games like Animal Crossing, where you can collect fossils and then put them into your museum. And then the last category was ancient animals as tools. So, for instance, in the Total War Warhammer games, you can ride dinosaurs and all sorts of ancient animals, or your armies can. So you're using those ancient animals as tools. So that's the main categories. But that's a huge, broad range of games. Pretty much every genre of game includes some sort of ancient animal in it.
But ultimately, none of those games are aimed at anyone to be educational. They're purely for entertainment. It's just almost, that's not coincidental, but there's this brilliant idea that the paper about volcanoes that we mentioned earlier sort of introduced us to, which is this idea of tangential learning. So when you go to a museum, you're deliberately hoping to learn something new, or say watching a documentary or something. But when you're playing a game or watching a film or anything like that, you can subconsciously gain information from that entertainment that wasn't designed to be educational, may not have even been intended by the creator of the thing you're watching. The only problem there is that things that are inaccurate, like factoids and mistakes, can be just as easily imparted to the audience as actual factual information that somehow manages to slip through as well. That's the thing that connects all of those games, I suppose.
So you could be shooting the face off a very accurate velociraptor.
Yeah, so I can give you two really good examples, or just off the top of my head. So there's a first-person shooter called Orion Prelude, which has a carnivorous stegosaurus that will try to eat you, which is obviously incorrect because stegosauruses are herbivorous. Another one which we thought was absolutely brilliant was in The Sims. Jake, is it Sims 4?
It's The Sims 4.
It's The Sims 4. So they have lots of different fossils that you can collect. And some of those are genuine fossils, like a hominid skull or a raptor claw. But they also have things like a fossilized cow udder and a very well-preserved fossil mustache, which is a classic. So the game is not trying to be educational. It's not trying to teach you about fossils. But by including the fossils and including the information about the fossils and then mixing basically science fact with science fiction, it could mean that the audience is misled into the fact that a mustache might turn into a fossil.
That's quite an extreme example, but also
it's a hilarious example.
Oh, it's amazing. It's incredible. I hope to one day find a fossil udder. Oh my God. But
oh God.
That's a nature paper.
Oh, yeah. 100%. But things like Animal Crossing, I adore Animal Crossing New Horizons, especially. The fossil collecting in that game is so incredible. And once you've collected all your fossils, they kept putting this beautiful museum that's arranged phylogenetically. It's incredible. But then also there are some other dicier issues in that, such as how quickly you can find the fossils, how, and what you then go on to do with them, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit as well, I imagine. It's really weird, this kind of blending of, science fact and science fiction.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the reasons why we wrote this paper in the first place was just to highlight that, not necessarily to criticize it. The aim of the paper is not to say whether games are good or games are bad, but merely to point out to science communicators that this kind of mixing and matching does happen, and they do need to be aware of it. Because, like Jake said earlier, I can name examples where I've been doing science outreach and someone has come up to me and said, oh, my favorite dinosaur is, and then named an animal that isn't either a dinosaur or even real sometimes, based on video games that they've been playing.
Oh, yeah, I can see the issues with it. And yeah, it's a really hard thing to try and do these game development companies owe anything to paleontology to try and be scientifically accurate, or are they just trying to create the most entertaining game that they can?
I think it's definitely the latter. I think that they, often they'll sacrifice accuracy for entertainment, which is absolutely fine. That's their prerogative. I think the problem comes when they try to, be scientifically accurate, or when a game professes itself to be realistic and then incorporates errors. That's obviously very problematic. But there aren't many games out there that actually do that.
I'm just about a hair's width away from going on a rant about documentary making and similar issues in there as well.
I mean,
that's a whole other podcast.
Probably the people who make documentaries, not us.
Well, I think that's a good point, though, because documentaries and all these individual video games don't all exist in a bubble. They're all inspired by each other, they're all influenced by each other. So that's why these tropes sort of propagate from one game to the next. Like the amount of games that deal with, extracting DNA from fossil amber or something. It's all very obvious where these things come from.
Yeah, that's a really good example. So let's talk a little bit about a game that does this kind of thing. So Jurassic World Evolution is a really good example here. So Jurassic World Evolution, for those of you who haven't played it, is basically based on the Jurassic Park franchise. It's a park building simulator. So you're basically tasked with, you get a plot of land and you have to build the facilities to genetically clone dinosaurs, incubate them in their eggs, and then they hatch, and then you have to look after the dinosaurs, while at the same time managing the park, getting people to come in and out. And it does a lot of things really, really well. It has really good information about the dinosaurs. It has little fact files that people can read about the dinosaurs so they can learn about the dinosaurs. It also has, where you can collect the fossils from are all real world localities. And they actually name really famous fossil sites, which is all really good, really excellent sort of paleo information. Now, on the negative side, obviously their aesthetic is based on the Jurassic Park sort of franchise, and not a lot we can do about that. That's if they want to make all their dinosaurs grey and scaly, then they make all their dinosaurs grey and scaly. That's their bag. But my problem in Jurassic World Evolution, for instance, is where they cross over into weird paleo ethics. And so, for instance, in order to get genetic material, you collect fossils, and if they're not dinosaur fossils, then you just sell them. There's no other option to do anything with them. You just sell them for monetary value, which is obviously, as scientists, is quite a problematic thing. And then moreover, one of the things we talk about a lot in the paper is that a lot of these fossil sites are illegal to collect fossils from, but they don't address that in the game because obviously it would break the sort of the gameplay and the immersion in it. So they completely gloss over all the ethical issues. So, for instance, you can go to Mongolia and just extract dinosaur fossils, no questions asked, which obviously in real life you can't do. So with those kind of games, it's really interesting. It's on one side, they're trying to be accurate, but on the other side, they're obviously glossing over stuff in order just to make an engaging game. And I'm not saying that that's a bad game, and I'm not saying that they're doing something wrong. But what I am saying is that as scientists, as science communicators, we need to be aware of that, so that we can sort of, in our communication work, we can sort of say whether or not that is accurate.
Yeah, like I said before about Animal Crossing, once you've filled your museum, any excess fossils that you find get sold at the pawn shop, and they're actually one of the most expensive things in the game, which is really useful when you're just starting out on your island. You pretty much find yourself selling fossils quite often. In a lot of games where you can collect resources like Stardew Valley and Starbound and Terraria, and even The Sims 4 as well, the option to sell fossils is presented as a very standard part of paleontological research, and it kind of just isn't the case. And what's really interesting is there are really high-profile auctions of fossil material going on literally right now. I think last week, very well-timed with our paper, a T-Rex skeleton, I think, has expected to sell for $25 million. Last time this happened, it was over $30 million, which is insane. That money could have been spent towards so much actual research, and it obviously takes fossils out of the, public domain. Once a specimen becomes private, it becomes way harder to actually work on it and publish on it. And yet these issues are just treated as, it's just standard practice. That's what you do as a paleontologist. You sell them. It's extremely common, probably one of the most common tropes that we came across.
And it doesn't help to dispel that. It kind of reinforces it in the public's eye. So, and if you go on things like Fossil ID on Reddit or something, where people go and ask others what a fossil they found actually is, the first question is, what is it? The second question is often, how much is it worth? And it's always a rugose coral.
I think that's the trickiest thing about writing this paper, or was one of the tricky things about writing this paper, is that a video game presenting paleontology with some unethical aspects isn't necessarily inaccurate. These unethical practices happen. Fossils are smuggled out of countries that they're not supposed to be. It's just that games don't do anything to actually address them. Having, Jurassic Park, the whole point of that franchise, right, is about unethical science. It would have been really interesting if that had come up in the plot of the game, but it just doesn't. They just didn't really think about it. And it's kind of a shame. It's such a missed opportunity for some really interesting outreach. But what it does mean is that we can tell this to our fellow science communicators, and next time they do a talk, they can say, has anyone here played Jurassic World Evolution? Well, have you ever noticed this? And it's a really good little touchstone that we can now use going forward, which I'm really pleased with.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the negatives and the positives. Negatives first. Let's talk about the negatives. Okay, what are some of the common tropes? As you've mentioned, there are tropes in these games, but what keeps on cropping up? What are some of these negative tropes that are given a poor public perception of paleontology?
I think that by far the most common trope that we find is monsterification, which is a brilliant word that I've never thought I'd really use in any papers or research I would ever do, but it's something that paleo artists often say a lot. We're not necessarily interested in sort of animal reconstruction accuracy. That's not really something that interests me and Thomas that much, but monsterification is a really interesting issue that is so common in video games and other forms of media as well, where you basically take an ancient animal and turn it into this bloodthirsty monster. And for dinosaurs, this often means making them like 10 times bigger than they would be, covering them in big spikes and spines, giving them giant teeth, and also changing their behavior. And that's the thing that makes video games separate from films, entertainment. You're not just seeing these things, but you're interacting with them. You're being chased by them or hunting them. And I found a really interesting paper that kind of talked about this idea in living animals. So I've been playing Elden Ring a lot recently, and there's other games like Skyrim and Breath of the Wild where you can encounter animals like, they're quite docile, sort of herbivores, like your deer and elk and things. But then you run into enemies like wolves and bears. And in games like Elden Ring and Skyrim, the wolves and bears are like, completely disproportioned and really scraggly with the big, like, bloodshot eyes to make them, convey to the player this is an enemy and it's going to behave like an enemy and attack you. But when it's living animals, herbivores, they get to be nice and docile, sort of nice set dressing. But with ancient animals, there's this really weird twist where any animal, regardless of its ecology or its diet, like Thomas mentioned earlier in Orion Prelude or whatever it was called, you have Stegosaurus and Triceratops just charging, screaming at you, and it's so weird. I think the big problem that this ends up producing is that it tells players that there's a disconnect between living animals and ancient animals. Which is a real shame because so much of recent research has been about how these animals are literally, they're just animals, which is such a shame to miss out on that connection because as science communicators, we still, to the viewers of this podcast, this is going to sound absurd, but we still often talk to members of the public who really struggle grasping the idea that living birds are the descendants of dinosaurs or that living tetrapods, we're all the shared, descendant of lobe-finned fish. It's really frustrating, actually, just how common this trope is. I had a really weird moment where I kind of thought about how you could very easily change dinosaurs in games where dinosaurs are these adversaries like Second Extinction and Orion. You could turn them so easily into dragons or zombies or robots, and tonally it would be exactly the same. But if you were to change them into like wolves or lions, it would be a very, very strange tonal shift. It's very strange how easily we can depict dinosaurs and other ancient animals in that way.
Do different dinosaurs have similar behaviors or in computer game ecologies between computer games? Okay, so an example would be here's a Triceratops and it does like a mega charge at the player, or here's a Stegosaurus or Ankylosaurus just spinning around swinging its tail. Do they have those set characteristics, those set characterizations?
Yeah, I guess so. And again, they just kind of like, I hate to use this word because it now means something completely different, but like the word meme, like literally is like, as in like a repetition of something. That is kind of what happens in these video games. The sort of quote unquote meme of the, Triceratops charging just gets passed on from one game to the other. My other little theory behind that is that a lot of these games might instead of coming up with something new, it's a lot more, it's better for time and money. You can just download like free assets of these animals that have all their animations all coded in already. Maybe that's sort of part of it, but I think it's just they want like animals to be familiar and they want it to be something that the player recognizes and knows and wants to see. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Dilophosaurus spitting toxic goo everywhere.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you, Jurassic Park.
I think I was going to kind of just tag on to that as well, is that I think a lot of this just stems from just media in general, right? If you grew up watching films where, the sort of T-Rex stumbles around and like a really good example is like before it attacks anything or before it eats anything, it lets out this massive roar, which is, no animal does that. You don't sneak up on something and then roar in its face. But yet we see that being perpetuated in video games and in the media because that's what people almost come to expect. And they almost think it's a bit disappointing if it doesn't do that. And like you said about the ankylosaur and the stegosaur just swinging its tail around willy-nilly, I think that's another thing that is just perpetuated by the media and that video games have just picked up that trope as well and just continue to run with.
But that's a trope that's been going for literally like centuries at this point.
Yeah, exactly,
like, some of the earliest depictions of ancient animals like the Crystal Palace ichthyosaurs are these horrible serpents kind of crawling around, and the old paintings from like what's his name, Henry de la Beche, who kind of sucks obviously, his paintings of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs as these disgusting monsters have just permeated through the years.
Yeah, so it's not a problem inherent to paleo gaming, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it doesn't do anything to fix or to prevent this kind of depiction, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got monsterification.
Monsterification.
We turn them into monsters, right? what other tropes are there?
So there's quite a lot of different. We go into quite a lot of detail about different ones. I mean, one of the classic tropes that we've kind of touched on without even really touching on it is the fact that there's a lack of diversity in paleo games when it comes to the actual ancient animals. So, for instance, when we think of ancient animals, typically most people just go straight to dinosaurs. Dinosaurs lived for a very long time, geologically speaking, but they represent a very small portion of ancient history. And so, the other classic ecosystem is the Ice Age animals, so woolly mammoths and saber cats and things like that. And there are some games that do sort of subvert that trope and specifically, try to showcase other animal groups from different periods of geological time. But that is a classic one, is just if it's got ancient animals in it, chances are it's a dinosaur.
And often when it is dinosaurs, it's the usual suspects of T-Rex, Triceratops.
Yeah, it's always North American dinosaurs because they're the most famous, right? So, with the exception of maybe Velociraptor.
But then the other weird flip side of this as well, to complicate it even further, is a game like Ark Survival Evolved has a huge range of different animals from throughout geological time. It's got synapsids and some weird stem birds and all sorts of interesting fishes and all sorts of things. But they all live at the same time. And that can also confuse a lot of players. A lot of people don't quite grasp just how sort of spaced out a lot of these creatures are and how dinosaurs did not live alongside synapsids, for instance.
Yeah, and Ark brings us nicely onto one of the other tropes, which is where you mix, ancient animals with animals that are mythical, and that can be quite confusing as well. If in a game you can ride a T-Rex and then jump off it and jump straight onto a wyvern, it might, confuse some people about whether or not wyverns were actually, especially if you depict them very realistically. Then that can be quite confusing, I think, for some players. I have had kids come up to me at outreach events asking me if certain types of dragons and things were if we have fossils of them, and I had to sadly explain to them that they're not real animals.
And it just pushes dinosaurs again further from actual living organisms into the sort of realm of myth and monsters, which is just unfortunate, really.
Yeah, so we turn them into monsters. We assume everything's a dinosaur. We've got anachronistic anachronisms, different dinosaurs from different periods and times hanging out with each other. We give them silly ecologies. We could just go on for hours, could we?
I think so. Those are the most of the sort of negative tropes. Obviously, we've bundled them all together for this podcast, but there's a lot more nuance in it, especially because, you know, different games deal with these in different ways. That's the aspect that sort of pertains to ancient animals. Obviously, there's a lot of tropes that actually pertain to paleontological science itself, which are equally problematic, and I would argue actually sometimes much, much worse, because, you know, the ancient animal side of things, that can be easily dispelled by reading books and stuff, and by going online and, you know, Wikipedia and other sources. But I think a lot of the more subversive and problematic tropes actually pertain to our science itself, the way we depict paleontology and the way we depict the people that do paleontology. And I think games are quite guilty sometimes of perpetuating really damaging tropes in that regard.
One of the most common tropes in how paleontologists are depicted in media is as these sort of lone, rugged heroes kind of standing against the world, which is really unfortunate because it just does not portray the collaborative work of paleontologists, and it often pushes these sort of it just pushes like the completely wrong idea, and yet that is also basically the plot of every video game ever written. It is almost inescapable.
And I think one of the other really damaging things as well is that within paleontology as a field, it's not a particularly diverse field. You know, it is very male orientated and very predominantly white people. And I think most video games perpetuate those tropes by, you know, making their main characters or the paleontologists in the games predominantly white, able-bodied men. And we see that time and time again. And we go into that in some detail in the paper about, you know, this perpetuation of this sort of male pale trope, but also the fact that when they do many video games, when they do have either women or people of color as the main character, or as a paleontologist, as a scientist, they often undermine them at every opportunity they can and sort of belittle them, often very subtly, which is really problematic when we're trying to diversify our field and trying to get more people and more diverse voices into our field. Because if you're not seeing role models, and all you're seeing is like gendered stereotypes, it's not really going to potentially make people who don't fit into those stereotypes think, oh yeah, I can be a paleontologist. And that's really problematic. So we flag that a lot in the paper.
Yeah, these are games that literally build themselves as paleontologist simulators. It's not just about your representation. It's literally putting yourself in the shoes of a paleontologist in a video game. And yet your choice of characters is extremely limited.
I know the one that you're talking about, a paleontologist simulator, and you just look like Indiana Jones.
Classic fedora.
And I think that might actually lead on to this idea of the people making these games potentially as well. I don't know if that's the right way to word it, but we see a lot of sort of harmful, misogynistic and racist tropes in a lot of paleo-inspired games as well. One thing that I noticed is that paleontology is almost kind of intrinsically linked to that sort of lost world fantasy genre, sort of, the Amazon basin, the white explorers kind of exploring and uncovering this untouched land that's often inexplicably populated by dinosaurs. This comes up in a lot of different video games as well. And combined with a depiction of sort of early humans in a lot of video games as well, there are a lot of examples of exotification and sexist tropes, or hypersexualization of female characters, I should say, which again really fails to help improve diversity within our field if that's how it's depicted in entertainment.
So, who are some of the worst culprits? Which games, which titles? Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall and Liz Martin Silverstone, with contributions from Tom Fletcher, Vish Venkat, and Elsa Pancharoli. Music was composed by Patrick Kendall Smith. Paleocast was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on funding from you, the listeners. So, if you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programs, and follow us across social media platforms to get all the latest news. Finally, if you enjoy our podcast, then please explore all of our video content on YouTube and follow our other projects, the Virtual Natural History Museum and the Paleocast Gaming Network.